a speed bump. And no matter how slowly and smoothly you think you're doing it, it's still like more than you expected. It doesn't feel smooth, right? So I'm going to try to run over a speed bump here and make it as smooth as possible, but you're going to feel a little bit of a jerk regardless. So back as early as the spring of this year, my plan was to have our fall Sunday, our whole Sunday school season talking about issues of marriage and family. And so I met with Josh over the summertime, and he was working through something a little bit different. I don't think I fully appreciated how different, but he was like, it's close. It's all in there. It's all kind of related, he said, and it somewhat is, because we're going to get into, in Ezra and Nehemiah, both books, talk about the issue of Israel has to, those who had taken foreign wives are to put away their foreign wives. And that is an issue that is going to come up, actually, in this discussion at some point on how is that applied? Is that relevant to the issues of marriage and family, divorce, remarriage, all of those sorts of things? So, and it is relevant to, in terms of rebuilding society, the family being a core component of what society is. So there is some overlap. Nonetheless, it's going to feel like a little bit of a bump as we go back and forth. So Josh is going to be away in Florida for probably a month over the Christmas season, and so during that time, I will continue to do this series on marriage and family. I want to start out in our first session on this topic this morning by talking about two different words. This is a product of my labors for a course I took on marriage and family at the beginning of this year. And one of the key things I took away in my study in that course, especially the issue I had to write on divorce and remarriage, was the difference between ontology and casuistry. So ontology, I'll write it out here. Does anybody know what ontology we get from that? We get the word ontological. Does everybody know or does anybody know what ontology means? Related to it. Teleology would be more toward ends, yes, and purpose. Why was the thing made? Yeah. Being, right? So it's the study of being or the study of reality. What is, okay? Versus casuistry. Anybody know what that is? Casuistry is applying principles, maybe broad principles, or case law, to particular circumstances. That's the positive way of putting it. Sometimes casuistry is used as a negative word, because you might picture somebody when you get a handbook, your school handbook or your workplace's handbook, and you start to read it for what it doesn't say, right? If you put a rule out that says, for a school handbook, do not run in the hallway. And you might say, well, it doesn't say I can't run around in the classroom, right? That's a kind of negative form of casuistry, the lawyerly reading between the lines of what it technically does or does not say. But a positive way of looking at it is taking rather broad principles or cases and trying to apply them to a new case. What are the implications of these principles? And what I found is that oftentimes when we study the topic of marriage, divorce, remarriage, anything related to family issues like that, oftentimes the discussion falls into this category of casuistry, and I would say more in the negative way that I describe that, rather than ontology. So when we talk about divorce, remarriage, marriage, what is the family? We tend to talk more about what can I technically do and get away with, as opposed to what is marriage. Okay? What is the thing in and of itself? And we get into, well, technically there's this verse in the Bible that says, she can't do this, and she did that. And the response is yes, because he did this. And his response is yes, because 5 years ago you did that. Yes, because you're always like this. And so it goes back and forth, and every party will justify their position based on something someone else did and try to find a verse to cover it. And so casuistry, and even among churches, in elders in churches, it's about what allows me to get out of this marriage. You go looking for a verse to find how I can get out of it, rather than thinking about what is marriage ontologically. And so that is going to be a major theme I'm going to be hitting on throughout this whole series. By the way, thinking ontologically is exactly what Jesus does. We'll look at this. We're not looking at this text today. We will in the future, but when Jesus is approached by the Pharisees and he's asked, can a man divorce his wife for any reason or, for only one reason, and they're trying to get into the specifics, the casuistry of the law. They're going back to Deuteronomy 24. And there were two different schools of thought, of interpretation on that in the Pharisaical schools. We'll get all into that later. But Jesus is not interested in having that conversation. He makes the ontological point, saying, what was marriage designed to be? In the beginning, God said this, what is marriage? And he traps the Pharisees by going back to what marriage is, rather than trying to parse the words to debate how often or for what excuse can I use to get out of marriage, right? So that theme is something I'm going to constantly be going back to in this series. Now today, I want to raise and answer this question. The topic for today is simply this. Was there something unique about the revelation to Israel concerning the ontology of the family? Or did Israel simply borrow from the mythologies of her pagan neighbors? So is there something unique about the revelation in Scripture, what Scripture teaches about marriage and family, about what it is, that's unique to Israel? Or is Israel just kind of copying, making a hodgepodge of what the other pagan mythologies of the peoples around them? Spoiler alert for that question, the answer is this. When we contrast Israel's understanding of God and its implications for the family, we find that it is fundamentally unique from those nations surrounding her. Scripture presents a fundamentally unique way of thinking about the family opposed to their pagan neighbors. Think about this. In Israel's situation, where is Israel? Just picture it on a map. You might know where it is. It's the land of Palestine on the eastern side of the Mediterranean. But that's not all that it is. Basically, Israel functions as a superhighway, geographically, between the kingdom of Assyria in the northeast and Egypt in the southwest. Anybody going back and forth between those two ancient civilizations would be traveling through Israel. And armies would often travel through Israel. There is a flat area where it's easier to move armies through Palestine, go around the mountains, and Assyria and Egypt would often be at war. In fact, when Assyria is threatening Israel, right, and they ultimately will be taken in exile to Assyria, what is it that Israel's tendency is? Every time Israel's threatened, and they're condemned over and over for this, rather than calling on God, they call on Egypt to the south. And they're condemned by the prophets over and over for this because they want to go to Egypt to provide some national security rather than going to God to protect them from Assyria. But this is a really challenging situation for Israel being in this spot. They're supposed to be a unique people, unlike and completely unique from the cultures around them, not syncretizing or incorporating the pagan practices of those around them, and they're completely surrounded. They're to be a light to the nations. It'd be one thing if they could go off in a mountain someplace on the corner of the earth, but they're not. They're right in the middle of everything in the ancient world, and yet are called to be a distinct people. Now, this connects with something Josh was talking about last week, in that just been hitting on this for the last couple of weeks. What about all those particulars? Evening, morning prayers, the vessels out of the temple, people returning to their specific lands, following specific instructions for building the temple. Why are they so particular about all this stuff? Last week we were talking about not incorporating those who would become the Sumerians into their worship. Why are they so particular? Because if you are going to maintain a society in the middle of much larger pagan nations around you, and your country itself is basically a super highway for them to run through, you're going to have to be very intentional about your worship. Otherwise, it will quickly slip away and start blending in with the nations around you. Okay? But this is what Israel's called to do, and this all is under the point of, yes, Israel's revelation. Our story of creation, the first man, the first woman, the first family, is completely distinct and unique from the stories that the pagan religions told themselves. First of all, you have monotheism, okay? A monotheistic religion, Judaism, a monotheistic religion. The pagan religions in the ancient Near East surrounding them were polytheistic. Syncretism was a commonality shared by all the various pagan societies around Israel. Syncretism means they take a little bit of this, and I heard about this god over here, and a little bit about this god, and we make a religion of all these little bits and pieces. They'd copy each other, but they were all polytheistic. The mythologies and the rituals of polytheistic pagan religions were about explaining and manipulating natural phenomena, especially when it comes to fertility. Okay, and this is how we're going to get into marriage and family. The religions reflected their surroundings and tried to make sense of them. For example, if you live in Egypt and you deal with something like the Nile River, you're going to have a river god to explain why the river did not overflow its banks and water the crops this year and we had a bad harvest, or why it flooded all the crops out. And so the goal is to try to appease the river god so you get just the right amount of water so you have an abundant harvest, as just an example. But one, how do you explain the phenomena around you? And then, how do you manipulate the phenomena? Through various sacrifices, how do we please our God so they give us the right amount of rain? This was true in terms of Baal worship as well. Baal was worshipped among the Canaanites, and you find in Judges that the Israelites start incorporating Baal worship, which included these fertility cults, in order to bless their crops. So if you want your crops to be fertile, you engage in these sexual orgies and practices in the temple in order to mimic your gods, which I'll get to in a second, who are doing the same thing. If that's how the gods produce, that's how we should do it, and we should incorporate ourselves with what the gods are doing, appease them, and we will have fertility. We'll have children, we'll grow, we'll have blessing, we'll have crops. And as much as Israel is supposed to keep that stuff out, it is a constant temptation to them to fall back into these kinds of fertility cults that are characteristic of the Canaanite pagan religions and the empires around them. So deities were naturalistic. I've kind of said that already. Deities reflect the surroundings. If you live in a mountain region, you probably have gods of the mountain. If you live in a river region, you probably have river gods. Gods of the plain, gods of here, there, whatever. They reflect natural surroundings. These are naturalistic gods. And in these pagan religions, there's a close correspondence between the natural phenomena of the region and the particular gods that they worship. Okay? Again, that explanation and manipulation. We draw our conclusions about who God is from our geography, from the life we experience, right? And then, what's the goal? Manipulate those gods, to altering our environment and our surroundings in a way most advantageous to us. Now, when you worship the creature rather than the creator, as it talks about in Romans 1, which is what they're doing, you're making a god out of nature, out of creatures, right? So you're turning created beings, creatures, into gods. And when that happens, the creatures do not then start acting like God or gods. What you do is you create gods that act like the creatures, right? So when you make your creatures start worshiping the creature rather than the creator, you don't suddenly lift these creatures up so that they become God-like in the sense of the God we worship. What we see is the gods start acting and like creatures. We see this if you know anything about the Greek myths, right? Zeus and Poseidon and Ares and all of these gods act like humans. They're barely better, if they're better at all, than humans. But they're just like us, right? Motivated by the same sorts of things. That's an example. When you start worshiping the creature rather than the creator, it does not lift the creature up so that they look more like God. It makes your gods look more like creatures, and they act like creatures. So, the gods of these pagan religions, for example, did not create ex nihilo, out of nothing. In Israel's Torah, God pre-exists his creation, number one. He's complete in and of himself. He does not need anything. His creation is an act of pure will, not of necessity. It's a voluntary act. And he creates from absolutely nothing. He speaks and things come into existence. But how do these pagan gods, modeled after creatures, who act like creatures, how do they create? The way these pagan gods create is they create the same way creatures do, through sexual activity. They engage in sexual activity to produce the stuff that we see, the world that we see. The gods are gendered beings. Therefore, they are sexual beings. So gods engage in sexual activity to create. They do not create ex nihilo by the spoken word as our God does. So what this leads to is sexuality is assumed up into the divine realm. And that's my main point I'm going to keep coming back to, but the main point for today. Sexual activity, sex, maleness, femaleness, and sex is not a created thing that God makes and designs. It is something assumed into the divine that the gods do prior to creating anything. In fact, they have to do to create anything. Sexuality assumed up into the divine. Sexuality becomes divinized, a divine activity in a way. It's an activity of the gods that brings things into being. Therefore, in those religions, you have cult rituals that are practiced to produce fertility for nature and man. So when worshiping the Baal and the Asherah and these various pagan deities throughout the land of Canaan and in the surrounding regions, you engage in sexual activity in the temples as part of worship because that's what the gods do to bring life. And it's a divine activity. It's not something created by God for a specific purpose with a specific nature. It is a divine activity. Fertility cults were supposed to produce abundance on the earth. I talked about Baal already as a very important example of this that Israel keeps falling back into. There's a plausibility to this. Right? If I engage in this pleasure activity, I'm bringing God's blessing on the earth, on my crops, on my land, on my nation. And once again, we see here a very close connection between idolatry and immorality. And if you read through the epistles of Paul, as Paul is going out to the apostle to the Gentiles, he hammers on these two things. They're always connected. Idolatry, immorality. Idolatry, immorality. You can find it all over. Ephesians 5, for example, Romans 1. Again, the idolatry and the immorality go together. And in fact, when you have these little mini creeds and confessions that Paul gives in his letters, these little summaries of the faith, he includes those elements. Jesus, God's Son, died, was buried, rose again. So stop worshiping false idols and stop engaging in sexual immorality. You can see that in 1 Thessalonians, many other places. He gives these little summaries of the gospel. Worship, turn away from idols, worship the true God who sent his Son, died, rose again, and stop partaking in sexual immorality. Stop worshiping idols, stop being sexual immoral. That is in the briefest statement of Paul's gospel, because those two things always go together. Just to give you a quick example of this, I'm going to read just one example of this. There are many, many more in this particular book. This is called The Biblical and Theological Foundations of the Family. And I'm not going to read many of the others, one, for lack of time, and two, because they get more explicit, more vulgar. But just to give you a flavor of what the myths believe, the Canaanite myths, how they approach the issue. This is from a 2nd millennium Sumerian story, among the Sumerians. Okay, so one of their kind of quasi-biblical, scriptural texts, okay, about Enki, E-N-K-I, the god responsible for the universe and its fertility. And it's portrayed as a bull who mates with the river, who is imagined as a wild cow. Enki, the king of Abzu, overpowering in his majesty, speaks up with authority. My father, the king of the universe, brought me into existence in the universe. My ancestor, the king of all the lands, gathered together all the Mies, that's what they're called, placed the Mies in my hand. I am the fecund seed engendered by the great wild ox. I was firstborn, the son of An. I am the big brother of the gods. I am he who brings full prosperity. After Father Enki had lifted it over the Euphrates, he stood up proudly like a rampant bull. He lifts the penis, ejaculates, filled the Tigris with sparkling water. The Tigris surrendered to him as to a rampant bull. The water he brought is sparkling water. The grain he brought is checkered grain, and the people eat it. Many other examples, much more graphic than this, depicting creation as a sexual act that the gods engage in order to produce life and being. Okay? Very different from what we get in Genesis 1, right? Where God, and Genesis 2. So, what are the implications of these differences between a polytheistic religions and monotheistic religion where Yahweh is God? What are the implications? Number one, in a polytheistic religion, sex exists prior to creation. Sex exists prior to creation. It's not a created thing, as I was saying earlier. It is a divine activity that brings the creation into existence. The gods engage in sexual activity in order to create the world of creatures. Now contrast this with Israel's worldview, in which God's act of creation is purely an act of will. It is voluntary. It is not needed. It is not necessary. God is complete in himself prior to creation. He enjoys perfect love and perfect fellowship within the Trinity. He is not lonely. And creation is not essential to God's identity, right? Creation is not essential to God's identity. We can describe God and talk about God, who he is, without referring to creation at all. He is not becoming in any way. He is simply pure being. Another way of saying this is that God is pure actuality and not potentiality. If you use that phrase, you have a lot of potential, right? If somebody who has potential, it's meant to be a compliment, right? Because they have the ability to accomplish something that they have not yet accomplished. They have the ability to improve, right? God literally has no potential, which sounds like an insult, right? But God has no potential because he's not becoming. He is. He is pure being, we would say pure act or actuality. He's not going to become or grow. He doesn't set, New Year's resolutions or goals to be better at this or that. He's pure being in and of itself. He is not becoming anything. All right? And so because he is pure being, he does not need to create the world in order to improve himself. He is self-existent and complete in himself in every way. It is pure, generous gift and voluntary will that he creates at all. He does not need to engage in sexual activity. He cannot. He's not a sexual being in order to produce. So, sex is a product of creation, not pre-creation. Okay? That is one implication of this. Sex exists prior to creation in the polytheistic view, because the gods are sexualized, they have gender, and they need to engage in the activity to create. Second implication, fate. You read any of the ancient polytheistic from the religions, you find the role of fate. I referenced the Iliad this morning. One of the most fascinating things about the Iliad is that all-powerful Zeus, the thunder god, his hands are tied throughout. He wants to act in certain ways, but he can't. It's really up to fate. One of the most moving scenes, I think, in the Iliad is when his son, who is a demigod, Sarpedon, for the Trojans, is killed. And Zeus actually cries and can't do anything about it, because this is what fate had for him. So as powerful as he is, he's still, like Paul, who points out to the Ephesians in Acts 17, by your own admission, you're still missing a God up there. Your whole pantheon of gods still doesn't control fate. Who's that unknown God above all your gods that you're trying to pay tribute to? That's the God who made heaven and earth, who is the source of all life and being, Paul says in Acts 17. So you have this role of fate in all of these polytheistic, pagan, ancient religions. It doesn't matter if you go to the Norse myths, the Greek myths, the Egyptian myths, the Canaanite, Mesopotamian myths. There is this fate that's above these gods. Furthermore, since there's many gods and they act like humans, they're in competition with each other. See this in the Iliad as well. Some gods are on the side of the Trojans, some are on the side of the Greeks. They have different goals, and they butt heads with each other. Okay? They're in competition, and thus they're not ultimately in control. So, since there's something higher that's above them, fate, which is impersonal, fate's not personal. Fate doesn't care. Fate's not a being. It just is. It's impersonal, and it's above them. Human beings, this is what connects what I was saying before, human beings will copy what the gods are doing in order to manipulate the powers above the gods. The gods are beholden to fate and are trying to manipulate fate and get their will. So what do humans do? They follow their gods and try to tempt or test fate, right? But fate's an impersonal force. It does not care about you. You're trying to get it to do your will, but it is capricious. It is arbitrary. You don't know what fate has in mind. And so what this leads to is great uncertainty and angst in the ancient world throughout all these religions. Anxious people who are ultimately governed by an impersonal force that simply does not care. The gods are doing their best to manipulate fate, and humans do their best too, and try to get the gods to help them to test fate. So, giving a quote here from Joseph Atkinson in this book. Actually, I have two quotes here. He says, "Man in the ancient world experienced a fundamental uncertainty which could never be alleviated. Underlying the experience of the world within the pagan framework was a fundamental angst that proceeded from the pagan conception of the gods and the pagan understanding of fate or time. This is the inevitable consequence of a mythological worldview that not only sexualizes the divine realm, but also conversely provides a mythological understanding of the natural processes of generation in both nature and man." So the divine realm is sexualized, and the natural realm is, the natural realm, the sexuality of the natural realm goes into the divine realm. So the divine realm is sexualized, and it tries to provide mythological explanations of natural phenomena. So you look around and say, instead of pursuing scientific explanations of things, there's mythological interpretations of everything. Why did it rain today? Well, because this god is doing that or the other, okay? It was into this world of uncertainty and angst that the revelation to the Hebrews entered and fundamentally overturned these pagan conceptions, end quote. So, in the Hebrew worldview, there is no fatalistic, supra-divine realm, and that means there's no magic and ritual manipulation in the cult. So you don't engage in these practices, these sexual activities, these orgies, in order to manipulate the divine realm of the gods, because it's not an impersonal force. It's a personal force, and that God is in control. He cannot be manipulated. You don't sacrifice in order to get him on your side, okay? Gender, and this is what's most important as we're coming to the end here, gender and marriage and sexuality are part of the created order and cannot be defined apart from the created order. They have natures, okay, and that's really important. So sexuality comes, it's part of the creaturely realm, not the divine realm. It is not something that brings creation into being. It is a created thing. It's it's all creature, right? It's what, and if it's created, it has a nature. If it's created, it has a nature. It has a certain purpose, okay? So if you think of the person who invented the hammer, okay? You have a hammer, it's a tool, it's a creature, it has a purpose, right? If you pick up a wrench, it is a created thing that's been fashioned for a particular use, right? It has an end or a purpose. It has a teleology, right? And if you start using the hammer, which was created for one thing, as a wrench, you're going to have problems. Created things have natures, purposes, ends. God, think about this, God doesn't have an end. Like, and I got to be careful here. In the sense, we could say, well, God's end, his ultimate end, is to glorify himself. And that he creates and he redeems and he glorifies because he wants to. But when we're talking about that kind of end, that is a goal he has for his creatures. God himself does not have an end. This goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. He is not purposing for himself to become anything. But so God, as we would say, does not have an end. He does not have a nature, a created nature. We could talk about divine nature, but that is not what we're talking about here when we're talking about created things with natures. God doesn't have an end. God doesn't have a nature. When you have created things, they have natures. They have ends. They have purposes. So the question becomes, what is the nature of that thing? If gender is created, males are created, what is the purpose of masculinity? What is maleness? Well, you're going to have to talk to the Creator and find out. What is femaleness? What is a woman? I think there's a documentary with that title, right? Well, they have a nature, and that means they have an end. What were they created for? Sexuality, marriage. Well, if marriage is created by God, it has a nature, it has an end. What was it created for? What is it? The ontology question. However, if sex pre-exists creation, it's just divine activity. It doesn't have a nature. It doesn't have what was it created for. It's just what the gods do, and so you do it in order to try to manipulate fate. It doesn't have a nature or a purpose. It's not a created thing. It's brought into the creaturely realm, and through it, the creaturely realm it comes into being. So that's a very important distinction. In the polytheistic religions in the ancient world see sex as prior to nature, prior to creation. The Christian worldview sees it as having a nature. All of these questions, maleness, femaleness, marriage, sexuality, these are created things. Therefore, they have natures, they have ends. How do we know what their nature or their end is? Well, how about the person who created them? Okay. Now, the argument here, that's basically where I want to end today. What's happening in the world today in the realm of sexuality is we're being repaganized. Where paganism treats sexuality, think about this, our pagan secular culture treats sexuality not as something with a nature that was created for a particular purpose, but as semi-divine. It's a divine activity. How dare you question what I'm doing? It's on the level of a pagan religion. It is divine activity. It's a way of expressing myself and making my way in the world just like whether they want to acknowledge them or not, gods do. It doesn't have a nature. It doesn't have a purpose. It doesn't have an intent or an end. It's semi-divine. And that is what we're doing. The idolatry and the immorality always go together. We saw it in the ancient world as it comes into the Christian world, and those things start to be left behind as we're seeing the reverse of the same two things. Idolatry and immorality. We are being repaganized with a lot of our sexual practices today. They're not just other choices. It is a return to the worldview of the ancient world and the idolatry that comes with it. That's all I have for today to lay the groundwork in terms of understanding ontology, what a thing is, and how a Christian view of an ontological view is going to differ from the pagan societies in the ancient world, especially in regard to these practices. Comments or questions? Can't guarantee I'll answer any of them, but